Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brad Thompson, and I am the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And I'd like to welcome all of you today to our John W. Pope Lecture Series. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsor of the event, the John W. Pope Foundation, which has generously supported this lecture series now for over a decade. And now a word about the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. The Clemson Institute is America's premier academic center dedicated to exploring the moral foundations of capitalism. As many of you know, the Clemson Institute is also the home of the Lyceum program, which is now recognized as one of America's most prestigious academic programs, providing students with a great books education in philosophy, literature, history, and politics. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Professor Allen Guelzo, who is one of America's greatest historians of the 19th century. Dr. Guelzo is the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar and Director of the Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship in the James Madison Program at Princeton University. Professor Guelzo is also the author of many important and influential books, including Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, The End of Slavery in America, Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America, and Fateful Lightning, A New History of the Civil War and Reconstruction. His book on the Battle of Gettysburg, titled Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, was a New York Times bestseller in 2013. His most recent books are Reconstruction, A Concise History, and Robert E. Lee, A Life. And he is now currently working on a new book about Lincoln and democracy. Mr. Guelzo is also well known around the world for his popular lecture series produced by The Teaching Company. And he writes or he has spoken on topics ranging from Mr. Lincoln to the American Revolution, and most recently, he's done a lecture course on America's founding fathers. Dr. Guelzo has served as a member of the National Council of the Humanities, and as if all that weren't enough, he was awarded the Distinguished Bradley Prize in 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Allen Guelzo to Clemson University.
First, let me extend a word of thanks to Brad and to Sydney for the invitation to come and speak here at Clemson. This is my first visit to Clemson, and I was astonished above all other things that astonish someone on this campus by the size of your football stadium. Nothing quite like it in any other parts of the world I've been in. Extraordinary. I'm also grateful to a number of friends, some old who I have reestablished connection with, some new. Eric, a new friend, Vernon, an old friend. How very nice in this wonderful environment to be able to talk, to have fellowship together, and to enjoy talking about Abraham Lincoln. So let me do exactly that. Given how much Abraham Lincoln is celebrated as the champion of democratic politics, it may be easy to miss just how much Lincoln's prescriptions for government are wound around economic issues. Perhaps this was simply a reflection of the contours of his law practice before the Civil War. Lincoln was involved in over 5,000 cases over a quarter century, and nearly 2/3 of his law practice concerned ordinary commercial issues: breach of contract, debt, mortgage, foreclosure, repossession or partition of property. In some respects, you could almost say that Abraham Lincoln as a lawyer was a repo man. On the other hand, commerce was exactly what Lincoln understood to be the full partner of democracy. since commerce and merchandising were, like democracy itself, no respecters of aristocratic privilege, and dollars were strictly the denomination of reason and logic. Property and freedom, as they had been for John Locke, were for Lincoln two hands that washed each other. And there seemed to Lincoln little in either that hobbled or contradicted each other. The proposition that each man should do precisely as he pleases with all that is exclusively his own, Lincoln said, is what lay at the foundation of the sense of justice there is in me. Lincoln had no share in the convictions of many thinkers in his day that the interests of workers and the interests of those for whom they worked were at odds with each other. 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer, Lincoln reflected in 1859. The hired laborer of yesterday labors on his own account today and will hire others to labor for him tomorrow. Rather than declaring any war upon capital, we wish to allow the humblest man an equal chance to get rich with everybody else. He had no illusions that everybody would necessarily prosper in this fashion. Some of you will be successful, he said. Others will be disappointed and will be in a less happy mood. But to those others, Lincoln's advice was, work harder. To such, he said, let it be said, lay it not too much to heart. Let them adopt the maxim, better luck next time, and then by renewed exertion, make that better luck for themselves. Not many tears being shed there. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, and it does us good to remember that at that moment, Thomas Jefferson was still president and George III was still king. It was a world lit by candlelight. The kerosene lamp would not be invented until 1855. It was a world in which travel and information proceeded no faster than horse or sail could carry them. Out of a total American workforce in 1820, 97% labored on farms. And given that no technology for preserving farm produce existed, the mason jar, for instance, was not invented until 1859. Farmers did not buy and sell to producers or processors or distant consumers. They consumed what they produced or swapped with each other. Anywhere beyond the reach of American towns, a subsistence economy rather than a market economy, and by a market economy we mean where people bought and exchanged goods with others at a distance for cash or credit. It was a subsistence economy, not a market economy, that prevailed in almost all American spaces. There was very little time spent in what deserves the name of business as now understood. Remembered an octogenarian survivor of those times in Lincoln's Illinois. Trade, barter, and exchange of commodities, and swapping work in corn planting and harvest time for work back in corn husking and haymaking time were the only commerce known in those early times. But a new economic world was already being born at the same moment as Lincoln. Just as the Enlightenment overthrew an old world of fixed political and social classes, it also overthrew a world of fixed economic classes. Jane Austen's characters could deplore people of low origin, in trade, and only moderately genteel. But at almost the same moment, Adam Smith was declaring in The Wealth of Nations that the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another was as natural a law of human nature as gravity was of physical nature. And certainly nothing made the shopkeeper or the merchant some kind of moral inferior. Suddenly, A market economy acquires respectability. Commerce, wrote the French Enlightenment philosophe Montesquieu, commerce cures destructive prejudices and produces in men a certain feeling for exact justice. Lincoln met the new world of commerce when he was only a boy on a raft, paddling passengers from the Ohio River shore to intercept steamboats on the Ohio River. As he remembered later, two men came down to the shore in carriages with trunks. They quickly hired him to row them out to the steamboat in midstream, and then each flipped him a silver $50. Lincoln was astonished. I could scarcely credit that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day, and that I had earned it by honest work. From that moment, he said, the world seemed wider and fairer before me. In 1832, after he had moved to New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln helped pilot the steamer Talisman up the Sangamon River in a bid to open up central Illinois to Mississippi River traffic. And in his first bid for elected office in the Illinois legislature that year, he campaigned on building avenues for markets through the opening of good roads and the clearing of navigable streams within their limits. Lincoln's eagerness to plunge into the swirl of commerce contrasted sharply with the attitudes of his family. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a simple subsistence farmer with no particular thought for economic advancement and even less comprehension of his son's ambitions. Thomas Lincoln was like the other people in that country. None of them worked to get ahead. There wasn't no market for nothing. The people raised just what they needed. Thomas Lincoln's son, however, was of a different mind. As soon as he turned 21 and could legally keep what he earned, Abraham Lincoln left his father's farm in central Illinois and never looked back. Setting up in New Salem, he hired himself out as a farm worker, a ferryman, a clerk, and a flatboater. Twice went into business and twice failed, and then became a lawyer. And in becoming a lawyer, became one of the oilers of the machinery of debt, commerce, and property. By the time he appeared for the last time in a courtroom in June of 1860, the Illinois Central Railroad was his second biggest client, and he had litigated hundreds of bridge, tax, real estate, and mechanical reaper cases in state and federal courts. It was not in the courtroom, however, but in the Illinois state legislature, where he served 4 terms between 1834 and 1842, that Lincoln's interest in commercial development found its largest outlet. Trade and exchange, he wrote for a legislative committee in 1840, are, like Adam Smith, part of an irresistible law. In his first campaign for the state legislature in 1832, Lincoln took for granted that no Illinois farmer wanted merely to idle away his advantages of its fertile soil, but would want some pathway to marketplaces where his produce could be sold for cash or for store credit. We need, Lincoln claimed, some more easy means of communication than we now possess for the purpose of facilitating the task of exporting the surplus products and importing the necessary articles from abroad. That, he proposed, would come by the application of art to the shallow waterways of central Illinois. Art, in this case, meaning canals. And he boasted to his friend Joshua Speed that he hoped that the promotion of canal projects modeled on DeWitt Clinton's Great Erie Canal would make him the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. Once elected to the legislature in 1834, Lincoln became an eager proponent of internal improvements to enable our state, in common with others, to dig canals and construct railroads. He also advocated a state banking system, which would bring the state and commerce into partnership by doubling the prices of the products of Illinois farmers and issuing a reliable paper currency that would fill their pockets with a sound circulating medium. Commerce would even guarantee a new and more peaceful society in Illinois, because, he said, commerce brings us together and makes us better friends. We like one another the more for it. Lincoln's interest in commerce and infrastructure steered him politically to the harbor of the Whig Party and to admiration of the Whigs' founder, Henry Clay. The War of 1812 had taught Henry Clay painful lessons about waging war against Great Britain, then the greatest industrial power on earth, and doing it, as Americans did in the War of 1812, with an economy built entirely on subsistence farmers like Thomas Lincoln. The defense of the nation, said Clay, required the creation of a market economy, and that meant championing three policies which became Henry Clay's American system: tariffs to protect American manufacturing, a national bank to provide startup capital, and a government-funded system of internal improvements to provide transportation to markets. The Whigs could not have been better designed to appeal to the ambitions and aspirations of Abraham Lincoln. And he would remain an old Henry Clay Whig until the Whig Party foundered in 1856. And then he joined with other Northern Whigs in the new Republican Party. But embracing Clay's American system also forced him into conflict with the Whigs' opposite number, the Democratic Party. In Lincoln's Illinois, Democrats had the political upper hand. And for much of his career as a Whig, Lincoln was a militantly partisan politician who organized Whig opposition to Illinois Democrats, wrote heated anti-democratic political journalism, and in one embarrassing instance, almost fought a duel with a Democratic rival. But Lincoln had a more fundamental economic reason for opposing the Democrats of his day. The Democrats of the 1830s and 1840s were the party of the old agrarian economy. And the hidden hand inside their resistance to a market economy was slavery. The slave-holding South was intensely democratic in its politics and built on a ruthlessly subordinated base of African American slaves, dominated by a handful of white agrarian plantation owners. And they were not shy, these plantation owners, in claiming that slave agriculture was far superior to commerce and manufacturing. The Virginian, George Fitzhugh, insisted that the unrestricted exploitation of so-called free society is more oppressive to the laborer than domestic slavery. After all, said Fitzhugh, the subsistence of a slave is safe. Translated into modern terms, he gets 3 squares a day, no matter what. He does not have to save, said Fitzhugh, for sickness or old age. He has not to provide for his family. And this, Fitzhugh cheerfully admitted, was not market capitalism. To the contrary, he wrote, a Southern farm is the beau ideal of communism. In fact, it was the only practicable form of socialism. Socialists, complained Fitzhugh, were simply afraid yet to pronounce the word. To this, Lincoln snorted angrily that although volume upon volume is written to prove slavery a very good thing, we never hear of the man who wishes to take the good of it by being a slave himself. Slavery apologists like Fitzhugh may declare that their slaves are better off than hired laborers amongst us. But, Lincoln said, how little they know whereof they speak. Lincoln did. He himself had been a hired man, and he didn't think he was worse off than a slave. Those who started out working for wages and were industrious and sober and honest in the pursuit of their own interests would, in time, accumulate capital and use that capital to hire other people to labor for them. Free labor promised mobility, movement, aspiration. The hired laborer, said Lincoln, with his ability to become an employer, must have every precedence over him who labors under the inducement of force. And why? Because, Lincoln said, free labor has the inspiration of hope, while pure slavery has no hope. Slavery was not the future Lincoln wanted for his America, and subsistence farming was not the way he had come up in the world. Lincoln's embrace of commerce has one root in his own personal experience, another in the politics of the Whig Party, another in his revulsion at slavery. But yet another root of that embrace lay in his study of political economy. There was no independent science called economics in Lincoln's day. What we would call economics was understood in Lincoln's time as political economy. Nevertheless, Lincoln's natural intellectual curiosity fed on political economy more than any other subject. Lincoln, I think, liked political economy, the study of it, recalled his law partner, William Henry Herndon. This was a recollection echoed by Shelby Cullom, who served with Lincoln in the Illinois legislature and then in Congress. Theoretically, said Cullom, Mr. Lincoln was strong on financial questions. On political economy, he was great. And as Herndon remembered in 1886, the backbone of Lincoln's reading in the 1840s and 1850s was in the basic texts of 19th century political economy. John Stuart Mill's political economy, this is on Herndon's list. Henry Carey's political economy, John Ramsay McCullough's political economy, Francis Wayland, and some others. Lincoln had only the most limited formal education, something which embarrassed him all of his life, but he had a ravenous intellectual curiosity and a near photographic memory. And he turned both loose on these writers. There are no direct references in Lincoln's speeches or writing to the ur-text of market economics, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But when Lincoln spoke of labor as the source from which human wants are mainly supplied, and therefore prior to and independent of capital, and deserving much the higher consideration, he was very close to channeling Smith, who wrote at the very opening of the Wealth of Nations that the annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessities and conveniences of life which it annually consumes. Like Lincoln, Smith lauded banks and the circulating notes of banks and bankers as the great wheel of circulation and distribution. In 1847, when Lincoln presented an analysis of the costs of transportation, he said, "It appears to me then that all labor done directly and incidentally in carrying articles to their place of consumption, which could have been produced in sufficient abundance with as little labor at the place of consumption as at the place they were carried from, is useless labor." That comment of Lincoln's directly parallels Smith's argument of land carriage and his argument in favor of domestic manufacturing and against the expense that increases very much both the real and nominal price of most manufactures. Above all, it is difficult not to hear Adam Smith in Lincoln's description of the legitimate object of government. since Smith anticipated Lincoln in arguing that government had only three duties. First, the duty of protecting the society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies. Secondly, the duty of protecting, as far as possible, every member of the society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it. And thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions, which it can never be for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals to erect and maintain. But much more than Adam Smith, it was John Stuart Mill whose hand appears in much of Lincoln's thinking. It was Mill whom Lincoln singled out as one of the two most influential authors he had ever read. And it was Mill who contributed a passage that Lincoln actually cribbed for his own purposes in his notes for a series of speeches that he gave in the fall of 1859 in Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The hired laborer of yesterday labors on his own account today and will hire others to labor for him tomorrow, Lincoln said. Advancement, improvement in condition is the order of things in a society of equals. Now this is plainly a borrowing from the 1848 American edition of Mill's Principles of Political Economy, where Mill writes, "To begin as hired laborers, then after a few years to work on their own account, and finally employ others is the normal condition of laborers in a new country rapidly increasing in wealth and population like America or Australia." Mill offered encouragement to Lincoln on several other points too. Like Lincoln, Mill was in favor of restricting to the narrowest compass the intervention of a public authority in the business of a community. And Lincoln's aversion to slavery could have received nothing but fuel from Stuart Mill, who denounced property in human beings as having no place whatsoever in any society, even pretending to be founded on justice or on fellowship between human creatures. Although he certainly would have also fed Lincoln's caution in approaching the abolition of slavery by recognizing that the state has expressly legalized it for generations, and therefore should, at the moment of abolishing slavery, make full compensation to slave owners. But Lincoln's most immediate intellectual reliance was on American political economists: Henry Carey, Calvin Colton, Francis Bowen, Erasmus Peshine Smith, Francis Wayland, names that all of you are intimately acquainted with. Or perhaps people in Lincoln's day were intimately acquainted with. For Henry Carey, as for Lincoln, the fundamental rule of economics was improvement, whether in the form of canals or social mobility. The predominant desire of man to maintain and to improve his condition according to the laws of nature is the governing feature of human society. Likewise, Carey argued, value is therefore not measured by quantity alone, but by quantity and quality of labor. Hence, labor is the sole cause of value. But the more valuable labor becomes, the more it aspires to be free labor and to transform itself by self-management. Men do not work only under the pressure of a strong necessity, as the apologists for slavery insisted. History shows, Carey said in 1853, that labor has become valuable and that man has become free at just the point when commerce and manufacturing have gained equal standing with the plowman and become diversified. After all, Carey reasoned, where there is nothing but agriculture, men must be idle for very much of their time. But when they are idle, they remain poor and weak, and they can have neither towns nor roads nor schools. Manufacturing can remedy this when men of this country advocate efficient protection for thought, speech, action, and trade. Lincoln carried his Whiggish understanding of political economy into the White House with his election as the first Republican president in 1860. Because Lincoln's most obvious problem was with slavery and the war triggered by the secession of the Southern states who sought to protect it, it's been easy to lose sight of the aggressive economic agenda that Lincoln and his fellow Republicans in Congress put into place during the Civil War. But aggressive it was. The Republican National Platform called for protective tariffs that would, frankly, encourage the development of the industrial interests and permit the flourishing of American markets. And Lincoln had scarcely been inaugurated before Henry Carey met with Lincoln to remind him that if Clay's tariff policies had been enacted, there would have been no secession, because the southern mineral region would long since have obtained control over the planting one. A new tariff bill, designed by Justin Smith Morrill, fixed import duties, eventually averaging over 46%, on over 1,500 imported products. In 1862, Morrill introduced a second tariff bill to protect American labor, American skill, and American soil, followed by yet a third tariff bill in 1864. All of these Lincoln signed without a murmur. Nothing had changed either in his views about banks. In 1861, Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase, a one-time Democrat and a very reluctant convert to banking, unveiled a proposal to control the circulation of paper money, which enters so largely into the transactions of commerce, through a system of notes prepared for circulation under national direction. The federal government would not create a national bank, but it would do what private and state banks had been doing for decades by issuing a federal currency, the greenbacks, which existing banks would then deal with and thus relieve the national from the competition of local circulation. The advantages would seem obvious. American commerce would get a circulation of notes bearing a common impression and authenticated by a common authority. And not surprisingly, those notes bore a picture of Salmon Chase. He got a little of his own in that way. Even the American people would be bound by the circulation of these greenbacks in a greater national loyalty, because that would be the currency with which they would deal every day. The American people would be bound by common interest that a common currency would promote. And in February of 1863, the Republican Congress would adopt a National Banking Act that would bring the North's 1,400 banks and the plethora of paper money they issued into this single system, replacing private money issues with federally printed money, and in turn capitalize the banks with federal deposits. Even farming would be transformed. When the first Republican Congress to assemble after Lincoln's election had been gavelled to order, Lincoln's strongest political ally in the House of Representatives, Owen Lovejoy, introduced a Homestead Act that opened vast stretches of government-owned public lands in the West to any claimant willing, for little more than a filing fee, to occupy and improve up to 160 acres of land. The Homestead Act, which would continue to operate until the 1970s, proved to be the single greatest act of privatization of government assets in American history. But the apex of Lincoln's economic agenda was the railroads. In 1861, Henry Carey proposed to Lincoln a system of railroads that would unite the interior of the continent with the cities of the Atlantic coast. This, Carey said, would cause slaves to become few in number and bind the hill country of Kentucky and West Virginia to the Union rather than to the Confederacy. But in 1862, Lincoln endorsed an even more grandiose railroad project, a transcontinental railroad that would link the flood of new homesteaders into the West to markets and suppliers across the continent. Legislation was introduced to support the construction of a great east-west railroad with grants to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies, ranging from $16,000 to $48,000 per mile. Lincoln signed the railroad legislation on July 1st, 1862. And had he lived to see the completion of the railroad at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10th, 1869, captured in this photograph, it might have been Abraham Lincoln in that picture rather than Leland Stanford, the president of the Central Pacific, driving the ceremonial golden spike that finally linked both sides of the continent. Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865 cut short his life, but not the trajectory of his economic reconstruction of the Union. Even had there been no Civil War, it is safe to say that Lincoln's administration would still be regarded as a hinge presidency in American history, if only for the way his economic policies inaugurated a new political generation that glorified free labor, protective tariffs, and federal encouragement for infrastructure. Yet, Lincoln was not without anxiety about the unforeseen consequences of these new developments. Lincoln's image of a market economy was a system of small producers, where the transition from hired laborer to employer seemed to have few obstacles, especially in Lincoln's Illinois. Protecting that small producer economy made Lincoln critical alike of crowned kings, money kings, and land kings. When he suspected Wall Street financiers of betting against Northern victory in the war, he wished every one of them had his devilish head shot off. But the risks of these new powers were overshadowed in his mind by an obligation to promote economic enablement. Lincoln was, as Ralph Waldo Emerson eulogized him on April 27, 1865, a middle-class president for a middle-class country. This man, said Emerson, wrought incessantly with all his might and all his honesty, laboring to find what the people wanted and how to obtain that. That enablement for what the people wanted was what ran through every piece of his administration's legislation, and even in the Emancipation Proclamation, where he urged freed slaves to labor faithfully for reasonable wages. This is an understanding of economics and democracy, of political economy, which it is easy to dismiss as antique and no longer applicable to the complexities of American life. Even by the beginning of the 20th century, Lincoln's notion of an economics of enablement had begun to seem in disrepair against the background of rapid, large-scale industrialization that required regulation. Helen Nicolay, the daughter of Lincoln's chief of staff, believed in 1913 that Lincoln's heart and mind were essentially of the old era of Henry Clay and the American system. So it was, as Richard Hofstadter once cruelly remarked, just as well that Lincoln died in 1865, since if he had lived to 70, said Hofstadter, he would have seen oppressive business corporations begin to close off those treasured opportunities for the little man and seen his own party become the jackal of the vested interests. We live now in an economy where few people seem to see Lincolnian independence as their goal. We seem to have become a society of permanent wage earners, living paycheck to paycheck, whose educations are almost entirely geared to training them to work for someone or something else than themselves. A place where Lincoln's vision of self-transformation is, as one letter writer to the New York Times recently complained, a false foundation and only a myth. Even worse, it is often an economy where government sees itself as the ally of those oppressive business corporations, and much more as a restrainer of economic independence than an enabler of it. And yet, we have not drifted so far from Lincoln's horizons that his economics have lost all possibility of realization. There are over 30 million small businesses in America, as opposed to just 18,500 large ones. Large, in this case, meaning 500 or more employees. And of those 30 million, an astonishing 73% are sole proprietorships. In 2021, in the depths of the pandemic and its lockdowns and shutdowns, Americans filed applications to begin 5.4 million new businesses, and followed that a year later with another 5 million. My great-grandparents were all immigrants, without so much as a penny to their names when they arrived in America between 1870 and 1885. One grandfather was an Irish-American paper hanger. One grandmother was the daughter of a Jewish tailor from Munich. The life I lead is a dramatic improvement on theirs, even as it is built on theirs. And it has come through no possession of title, of privilege, of influence. Even after a century and a half, Americans still look overwhelmingly like the free laborer whom Lincoln described, who saved means to buy lands of his own, a shop of his own, and to increase his property. This, Lincoln believed, was the true, genuine principle of free labor. And so, he said, so it may go on in one ceaseless round, so long as man exists on the face of the earth. Thank you very much.
Dr. Guelzo, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. We have lots of time now for questions and answers. We have a microphone down here at the bottom. I will place mine at the end of this row here. So it is the tradition of the Institute that we take our first few questions from students. So students come on and line up in these two rows, and then after we get a few students asking questions, then the floor will be open to the audience as a whole. So the floor is now open for questions. The floor is now open for questions.
All right, looks like you're number one.
You said about your story, and I think it's really inspirational. But how do you think that like your story and like contributed to your passion and like your studies? And do you think that contributed at all? And if so, how did it like influence your perspective as well?
May I stop you for a moment?
Yeah,
the
of course.
acoustic of the room echoes a great deal. It makes it very hard for me to hear clearly what you're asking.
Yeah,
and I
of
don't
course.
know if there's an easy, perhaps someone would like to interpret.
Yeah, like this?
Well, maybe I'll come a little closer.
Okay.
Tell me what your question is.
So you spoke about your story, and I think it's really inspirational. How do you think that your story contributed to your studies and your perspective on the matter?
Well, when you talk about perspective, especially for historians, you're really talking about many perspectives because there are many sub-disciplines within what we call history. So there are economic historians, there are social historians, there are intellectual historians, there are military historians. There are historians of architecture. There are historians of games. In many cases, the methodology of historians will actually differ almost as much as the subfields. I am primarily an intellectual historian. I'm not saying that to flatter myself. I'm saying that because I'm a historian of ideas. In this case, especially American ideas. What I look for are the connections of vocabulary. How are people using the language they're using about ideas? What are their connections with each other? What circles do they run in? How are they cross-pollinating with each other? What are the mediums that they use to communicate? Are they using newspapers? Are they using magazines? Are they using associations that meet a little bit like this to hear speakers? All of those things scramble the variety of ways that you can talk about historical method, especially for intellectual history. Now, with that kind of variety at work in intellectual history, you can begin to imagine how the variety of methodology changes for each of the subfields. I can't possibly begin to speak to all of them. I'm sure that economic historians play an awful lot with statistics. Alas, I was never really all that good with statistics. Math was not my long suit. I think the last time I did really well in school that way was in 10th grade geometry. But that's because the relations were all about logic. After that, total failure. So what you see before you is someone who has found himself as a historian because he was never really any good with numbers. I don't know if that's a comfort to you, but perhaps it can be an encouragement.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Hi, my name is Dylan, and I'm a freshman here. And I have a question about Lincoln and his plan. So, with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in mind, and as well as the fact that there were millions of slaves in the United States who went on
3.9 million.
Right, who went on to go face a lot of problems with the Jim Crow era and employment opportunities. Did he ever have a plan or acknowledge that there may be troubles for the former enslaved populations in the country to go on and go along his theory of being a laborer to an employer?
I'm glad you asked that question because my next lecture, which I have right here in my pocket, it actually does require, that's a marvelous question which will require a tremendous answer. Let me at least try to simplify it this way. Lincoln believed that emancipation was the great act of his administration. He said, this is what will set us down in history. And when people afterwards tried to get him to revoke it, or when people suggested he use it as a bargaining chip for peace with the Confederacy, he sent them packing. He said, if I tried to revoke the proclamation, I would be damned in time and eternity. As far as he was concerned, the Emancipation Proclamation was fixed and permanent. Now, what was it going to produce? Well, the Emancipation Proclamation only emancipates, doesn't do anything beyond that. And in a way, looking at a situation like that in 1863, what you discover is improvisation. In other words, you take one step, and then something like playing chess, you have to figure out what the next step is going to be because you don't have a plan ahead. There's no template. There's no what to do next for dummies that you can get in the bookstore. So Lincoln takes the next step of saying, all right, after emancipation, what's going to protect emancipation in the South? The vote. So toward the end of his life, he's talking about votes, especially, he says, votes for Southern blacks who have fought in the Union Army and who have earned that right simply by virtue of wearing the Union blue. He also talks about possession of property, because in many cases in the South, there were places, especially along the Carolina coasts and down into Georgia, where great plantations had been abandoned in the face of Union occupation. Well, one group of people who did not abandon those plantations were the former slaves. They continued to work them. And as they continued to work them, they pocketed now the proceeds. They were working for themselves. Lincoln issues a military order to protect them in that status. Because legally, where exactly were they? It was a kind of limbo. Lincoln wants to make clear, those who are working that land deserve the profits from working it. My order is going to protect that. Beyond that, we don't have a clear sense of what Lincoln thought would have to happen next. Lincoln was a very private man. He did not like to lay his plans out beforehand with people. He would have been a really difficult person to play poker against. And for that reason, we don't have an exact plan of Lincoln's for what might have happened after 1865. I think there are some reasonable deductions we can make, but we just don't have a specific sense from him of where he thought things were going to go. I think what is unavoidable is, by 1865, he understands that America is going to have to confront the fact that it is a biracial society. In fact, it is a multiracial society. And this is something he articulates actually several years before in a speech he gives in Chicago in July of 1858. He talks about how Americans reverence their revolution. But he says most of the people living in America today, in 1858, weren't around at the time of the revolution. In fact, he said fully as many as half of the people living in the United States came from another country, or they're the offspring of people who came from another country. They don't have a direct connection with the people who fought in the revolution. What's to bind them together? Ah, he says, there's this. No matter where they were born or where they came from, when they read in the Declaration of Independence those words, that all men are created equal, then they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of those old men that wrote the Declaration, and so they are. That love of liberty is the electric cord which unites all lovers of liberty around the world. For him, what made Americans Americans was that love of liberty, that proposition that at Gettysburg he said we were dedicated to. That arches far above considerations of race, of ethnicity, of religion, and unites people in a natural right that everyone possesses hardwired into them. A right to life, a right to liberty, a right to the pursuit of happiness. That is the arc that would have carried Lincoln forward in the years to come had he lived. And it is difficult not to think that we would be the better nation if he had lived. In one respect, we are still bleeding from the gunshot that killed him. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think what interested me most during your lecture was kind of the talk about Lincoln's love for large national projects.
I think they want you to get a little closer to the microphone.
I think what interested me most about your lecture was Lincoln's love for large international projects.
Yes.
And when I was sitting there, I was kind of looking up kind of the number of casualties I went into those projects. I think it was Erie Canal was 3,000, Transcontinental was 1,200, and then the Panama Canal I think was like 30,000. I know that like when the World Cup was going on, there was a lot of talk about Qatar and a lot of the deaths that went into the building of those stadiums. And I feel like a lot of that kind of, that big construction project labor has kind of deterred us. We kind of fallen away from wanting to engage in those large projects. So I guess my overall question would be, what would you say Lincoln's commentary would be on that kind of labor in today, especially with kind of the strives and protection of laborers that we've had?
Well, Lincoln insisted over and over again that he thought and spoke as a national man. In other words, not as someone speaking for Illinois, not as someone speaking for the North, certainly not as someone speaking for the South, even though he had been born in the South. He wanted to insist over and over again that he spoke for the nation as a whole. Now, this was very typical of the Whig Party. The Whigs had always spoken of themselves as the national party, as the party that was concerned with the identity of the nation rather than the identity of a section. So Lincoln understands himself as promoting the interests of the nation. Now, how do you do that? One major way you're able to do that is the promotion of these infrastructure projects, of internal improvements that will bind the parts of the nation together. Today, we think very easily of getting on a plane on the East Coast and flying to San Francisco. All right, that's a day's travel, right? All right, it's exhausting, but you get to San Francisco in a day. You're 5 or 6 hours en route getting there. San Francisco might as well have been on Mars in the 1860s. Travel in the 1860s, unless you were on a railroad, and by the way, the top speed of the railroads in Lincoln's day was 25 miles an hour, not what we would today call particularly fast. I mean, just think, when you were in driver's ed, when you had to drive in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, it felt like it was going to take forever, right? All right. Well, that being the case, if you were moving on land, by horse, by wagon, 25 miles a day was pretty well tops for you. You might get from here to Greenville in a day. That's a day's travel. That's the equivalent of getting from here to San Francisco in modern terms. So when Lincoln talks about binding the nation together, he is addressing a serious problem. Because what if there had been no transcontinental railroad? Well, there would be no intimate economic tie between the West Coast and the East Coast. And in that case, why shouldn't the West Coast just go off on its own and create its own separate confederacy? And many people were very afraid that was what was going to happen. But Lincoln saw these infrastructure projects as things which would bind together all of the North American continent as a single nation. So he's trying to accomplish not just an economic aim, he's also trying to accomplish a political aim. And that is the identity of all Americans as Americans in the American Republic. Whether they are in Maine, whether they're in Louisiana, or whether they're in California. And what's significant is how he believes that the chief path towards accomplishing that is an economic one. Give everybody a common economic stake, and they will soon enough discover all the other commonalities that bind them together. So his response to your question would be more in terms of, what is this going to do for the nation as a whole? How is it going to create a healthier nation as a system? And his confidence was that it would do exactly that. And step back for a moment and think about it. That is, in fact, what in many cases has happened. Because I'm sure there are many people here from places other than the upcountry of South Carolina. I mean, I could be wrong, someone correct me, but I would not be at all surprised if there was someone here from California, someone from Oregon, someone from Kansas, someone from Michigan. I know there are at least 2 people in this room from Canada. How does that happen? It happens because the economic infrastructure has been able to bring us together. It's been able to shrink distance. And that, Lincoln thought, would pay a tremendous political dividend in the long term.
But he would also be wary of political leaders. Of course, you want to use it to unify the nation, but he would be wary of them using it like, say, what Gaddafi does, where he uses it as a construction project to
Oh, he knew what corruption was all about, because nothing offers richer opportunities for economic corruption than war. So he was very well aware that while the Civil War was on, there were people who were making money in the most unhallowed fashion. Manufacturers who were creating uniforms that fall apart in the first rain. He knew that that was going on. He also knew that, all right, you could deal with that right away, you could identify some of these culprits, you could arrest them and throw them in jail, which he does, and he has suspended the writ of habeas corpus so he can throw them in jail and leave them there for as long as he likes. He's aware that that's there, but that's a risk he feels he has to run. It's a risk that the war demands that he run, and in the long term, it's a risk that he understands has to be run in any economy. If we expect moral purity from an economy, we are expecting something which has never been true of any economy, or for that matter, of human nature. So we run these risks because in the long run, there are risks that have to be run simply by getting up in the morning. And he is willing to take the burden of those, and the role of government then is to find out when people do exceed those legal boundaries, then the role of government is to step in and deal with them and protect people from them.
Thank you.
All right. Now I should give some attention to this side as well, if I may.
Hello, I'm Thad. I'm a freshman here, and I just had some questions about whether the numbers, or just how the numbers up here really reflect that Lincoln's ideal of starting out as an employee and eventually starting your own business is still feasible. So it looks to me like it's averaging about 5 million new business applications each year and 30 million businesses, which seems to work out to a small business only lasting 6 years, which I know he said try, fail, and fail again, but that's a lot of failing. And if you look at it that way, it seems like it's much more feasible to be an employee in terms of the long run, but I think in his day, you have better prospects being a business owner than you do an employee. Whereas now, it seems like all you ever hear in politics is help the small business owners, they're failing, and you never hear any pity for the aerospace engineers at Boeing who are employees, but...
Well, I think Lincoln would respond in 2 ways. One is to say, yes, people will start small businesses and they will fail. But what you want to do is to see that there is a virtue in the small business itself, in the scope of the small producer. In 1860, the average size of an industrial firm was 14 employees. 14. That means the owner of the outfit was down on the shop floor on a leather apron working alongside his employees in most places. When Lincoln looks at that, he says, all right, these will fail sometimes, but start up again, and that is actually good for motivating people because you can start again. And sometimes when you start again, you're going to be outrageously successful, and you're going to be successful beyond your own expectations of it. The other thing comes from the observations of a European observer in America in 1863 named George Fish. He spent 9 months in America. He was a Swiss religious pastor. And he wrote this remarkable series of observations about America. And one thing he said about the American economy was this. One thing which distinguishes the American economy from the European economy is someone starts out in business, goes bankrupt. In Europe, they're finished. Nobody will ever lend them 5 cents again. No one will ever help them. Their lives are ruined. You get one shot and that's it. In America, said Fish, someone starts a business, goes bankrupt, the next thing you know, they're turning around, they've declared bankruptcy, got out from under it, they go to the bank, borrow some more, start up again, fail again, go through the same process until finally they hit the jackpot. And he said, only in America is that kind of process encouraged. In Europe, one failure incurs the most dramatic condemnation. In America, people shrug their shoulders and say, okay, what's next for this guy? And that says, all right, here's a process which continues to go and to feed on itself. So yeah, there's plenty of failure. There's plenty of termination of things. And in some senses, that's not bad because there are some businesses which meet an immediate need and then that immediate need fades. What you see in American life is this constant mobility. And that constant mobility, that motion, that enablement, that was the thing that Lincoln thought was the great virtue of American economic life. Whereas what you saw by contrast in Europe was stasis, where things slowed to a glacial pace, where people only achieved if they had a finger on the scale in the form of some sympathetic nobleman or something like that. What a very different environment the American environment was. There was an encyclopedia that was published in the 1830s in Britain describing the contrast between the American and the British economies. And the compiler of that encyclopedia made the observation that in America, the entire attitude toward business and politics is so much more favorable to the individual entrepreneur that in America, there's almost no reason for anyone who has entrepreneurial skills to stay in Britain. Migrate to America. That's where you'll flourish. In a sense, that from 1834 is almost a direct answer to your question.
It is. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now, shall I go back over here? Yes? You are a patient person, yes? Yes. Oh, all right. Yes, please continue.
So I know you mentioned in one of the questions that was answered earlier, it's very difficult to speculate about what Lincoln would have done in regards to the social policies. But I was wondering, you mentioned a lot of the economic policies that he put in place during his first term. Is there any way you could speculate as to what some of his biggest economic goals would have been during his second term?
Well, I certainly think the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad would have been a major item for him. Beyond that, it's very difficult to say. I think he would have wanted to see the Homestead Act be more than just an office where you could sign up and claim land. I think he would like to encourage people to move to the West, take advantage of the Homestead Bill, and in a very real sense, I think that reflects part of what goes into the causality of the American Civil War. Because we often think about the American Civil War as the North versus the South, right? Actually, it was the North versus the South over the West, and what was going to happen in the West. That's what the Civil War is about. And both the Union and the Confederacy were really bidding against each other for what the future of the West was going to be. That was going to determine their futures. So when Lincoln is thinking in terms of what's going to happen next economically, the Homestead Act is a way of uniting the West for free labor and also uniting it as a single economic system, because the people who settled there in the West under the Homestead Act, how are they going to get their goods to market? The Transcontinental Railroad is going to be there. Now, and then the question asked before, what about corruption? Oh, if you want to talk about corruption, let's talk about the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Oh, that was corruption on a mega scale. The most famous piece of corruption being Credit Mobilier scale, which was basically a bank that bribed members of Congress. So yes, there was corruption in that. What would Lincoln have done with that kind of corruption? Well, it probably wouldn't have ended nicely for Leland Stanford. But nevertheless, this was a risk that had to be run if you were going to have the creation of this kind of transportation to markets. So his view of what the future was liable to look like in the West economically is really key to understanding what he thinks is going to happen to the country as a whole. And he wanted to ensure that the West was going to be open for free labor and free settlement, not as the Southern states wanted, opening the West for slave settlement and slave labor. That becomes the ultimate goal for Lincoln, and of course it is probably one of the single biggest results of the American Civil War.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I'll switch back over this way.
So you made some mention in, So you made some mention in your lecture on how today's universities, or universities in our education, begin to focus on and train us just to be laborers and never really move beyond that. How can we, maybe not we specifically, but how can we as a society begin to repurpose and refocus on our universities and create a more entrepreneurial education to prepare students for moving beyond just being a laborer?
Well, there is something to be said for being training to be a laborer, because I'd rather the plumber who comes to my house know about plumbing than not. The great mistake we have made in higher education is a mistake made, really the beginnings of it, 80 to 100 years ago, when American business and American corporations began to offload their training to colleges and universities. And colleges and universities were eager to line up and accept that offloading because that meant more revenue for them. But it has turned out to be, in many respects, a very difficult bargain, because now we are looking at colleges and universities, which in many cases seem to be nothing except the producers of worker bees. And the entire idea of a genuine education for a human being and for a citizen gets lost in the mix. So that we have people who are graduating with wonderful degrees in computer science or engineering, but who have never read the American Constitution. And it's very fine if that makes you a valuable employee. Good for you, I'm glad for it. But I mourn the fact that we lose our hold on citizenship and what that means, because fundamentally we live in a democracy where the burden of every aspect of it rests upon its citizens. And if we are composed as a democracy of something other than citizens, we will not have a democracy for very long. So my argument is all well and good to have training. Why don't we think about training as a separate vocational kind of education? But then think in a separate track and in a separate sphere about education, about civics, about classics, about ideas. Not that people can't cross-pollinate between the two, not that people can't have both, but that we don't make the one blot out the other because the one seems to pay more than the other. I think that that may, in the long run, be the key, not just to better citizens, but a better democracy as well. But you would like from me a blueprint for exactly how to create that? Wait for a few minutes, I'll give you one. Yes?
Good evening. My name's Sean Costigan. I'm a sophomore here. My question kind of goes to Lincoln's foresight into the Banking Act. In giving the federal government that much power to print money, did he foresee them being able to affect inflation or potentially taking more money out of Americans' pockets by, just being able to print whatever they want?
Well, he was very aware of the threat of inflation, But there was an even greater threat in the system that had prevailed before the National Banking Act and before the Civil War. I mean, imagine, and this is difficult for us to grasp today, but imagine an economy in which the only paper money that circulates is paper money issued by separate banks. So that if you, for instance, are banking at Malvern Federal, they're issuing currency of their own, backed by whatever is supposed to be in their vaults, but still, it's their own paper currency. Why would you accept that paper currency? Well, because if you've got a $1,000 debt that has to be paid, you don't want to try to do that in gold coins. All right, they're a little heavy. I mean, just try paying somebody in cattle and sheep. All right, so paper money is a shortcut to making commerce work. Now, if that's the case, do you really want the paper money that circulates to be from every Tom, Dick, and Harry bank in the country? How are you going to keep track of them all? You know, the most popular periodical in America before the Civil War was not the North American Review, it was not Harper's Illustrated, it was not even Funny Fellow, comic magazine of the day. It was the Currency Circular, which came out every month from a variety of sources, big fat thing that listed every banking issue and whether the bank that issued them was still in existence. Because of course somebody could come into your store and offer you the currency of a bank that had gone up into oblivion only a few months before. Now the Currency Circular would assure a merchant that the currency that was being given was still good. Or maybe it would say it's only half good, so you get to charge twice as much as before. Can you imagine the complexity of trying to do that with every transaction that you're responsible for? And yet you'd have to, or you could find yourself, you know, on the wrong end of a very serious bargain. That kind of cumbersome system only encumbers commerce and the economy itself. Whereas if you have a standardized federal currency, everybody knows what it's worth the same thing in every place, and it has the full faith and credit of the federal government behind it. Now you may scratch your head and say, well, you know, full faith and credit, what does that amount to? All right, well, yes, you're allowed to question that, it's a free country. However, has anyone here ever really walked up to the counter at a store and said, you know, I'm not so sure about this full faith and credit thing? No, no, no. We work under an attitude of acceptance. And that not only makes the economy work better, more efficiently, but it also binds us all together because we've all got the same currency in our wallets. You know, there's Lincoln on the $5 bill, Washington on the $1 bill, Hamilton on 10, Andrew Jackson on 20. Oh, you know the drill. That gives us something common across the country. That means that someone who goes from Pennsylvania to California can walk into a store in California and know that when they pull currency out of their pocket, it's going to be accepted. That's what full faith and credit ensures. That's what a common currency ensures. So yes, there are risks. There are risks of inflation. And Lincoln understood those risks even during the Civil War. But on the other hand, the risks have to be weighed against the benefits. And the benefits are both economic and political because of the way they bind the nation together.
My question is about, if I understood you correctly, you said that John Stuart Mill advocated the government not getting involved in the economy unless it was absolutely necessary.
Yes.
And that Lincoln adopted that thinking.
Yes.
But then you also were talking about Henry Clay's system of internal improvements, which was a lot of government involvement. So I was just wondering how Lincoln squared those things.
Government promotes, it enables, it provides opportunity for. Especially in the case of the railroads, it will even go to the extent of providing funding, which of course the railroads are going to have to pay back. But nevertheless, government enables that way. That's a very different attitude from what had prevailed in previous administrations before Lincoln, when the attitude was, no, we can't let commerce do that. That's going to make commerce too powerful. And of course, there was also this certain fear on the part of Southerners that a national commerce was going to undermine the total hold of slavery on Southern identity. So for that reason, people would balk at the idea that you're describing here. But we would look at it and say, no, 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 this is really a good thing, because this is a place where it is legitimate for government to have a role. Lincoln wrote a fragment because it was simply a part of a long note, a jotting that he wrote for speeches he would give. But he asked, what is government? What should government do? And in it, he identified these three roles of government. That government has to provide civil protection. In other words, there's got to be a military that protects you from invasion. There should be a government which is going to guarantee economic exchange. And there's a government which has to undertake certain tasks which people individually can't do on their own. I mean, we can't individually build bridges, all right? So it's going to have to be a common thing. You can't just have everyone doing their own school. You have common schools. And he was a strong advocate of public schooling. These are the legitimate tasks of government, Lincoln says. Beyond that, he's dubious. And in that respect, he's very clearly channeling what Stuart Mill writes in the 1848 edition of Principles of Political Economy. Now, let me jump one beyond you. This will make life much more complicated, I'm afraid. There are numerous John Stuart Mills. So you move through Mill's career and Mill's writing. His ideas will change. And the Principles of Political Economy will go through multiple editions. And it's very easy to take a John Stuart Mill on the other side of the American Civil War and play him off against a John Stuart Mill from 1848. That's simply in the nature of someone being John Stuart Mill. And people said that about Stuart Mill even then. But the Stuart Mill whom Lincoln encounters is the Stuart Mill of the Principles of Political Economy from the 1848 edition. And that is the Mill that he believes he's reflecting. And it's really that Mill that he refers to when he talks about Stuart Mill being one of the two authors who most influenced him. So that's the Mill we're looking for. And Mill talks about those three priorities for government, so does Lincoln, and if we're scratching our head to wonder where Lincoln got it from, I think the answer is pretty direct. It's because he's been reading Stuart Mill. All right?
Thank you.
Alan, on behalf of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful talk, and I'd ask the audience to join me in giving Dr. Guelzo a warm Clemson thank you.